So we've got commissioned to do this because of Museum of London. We'd previously done some work with them, which was a participatory creative project called Know Your Roots, getting young people in schools around the City of London to draw artworks and self-portraits about what their natural hair meant to them. And through that partnership, we got commissioned to do this report. And basically, the Museum of London was looking to help inform its curation, the future direction of the museum, and looked at two key questions. What are the issues that young Londoners care about? And what is the relationship between young people in their city? So basically, we broke down the report, which I think there is a link online for, but it's going to be formally released in the following weeks. And part one's around the issues, breaking it down. Number two is about how young people interact with space in terms of frequency. Number three is, what those spaces mean to them. And number four is the changing face of London. So how they feel about urban regeneration and gentrification, which was a topic particularly of interest in the Museum of London. So the first step for us in terms of participation was involving young Londoners. Remember when there was supposed to be like an election last year and then it got cancelled? So we'd actually done a lot of footwork for that and sort of anticipating a campaign. So we recruited a really diverse group of young people who are from a range of lived experiences, who were interested in talking at the mayoral campaigns, and we were having hustings. But then when that didn't happen, we still had and retained this group and kind of continued doing some work with them. We recruited a few more people just to make sure there was adequate sample of experiences and locations, because obviously it was a bigger project across London. And basically we helped them kind of understand what the project was about, get them to review the research question, kind of fine-tune some of the points, because the brief from Museum of London was thankfully quite broad, and then helped understand how they could write questions on the survey directly. So we did about 3 sessions with them, and their wording basically directly went into the survey for, I think about 30% of them were directly written, 20% of them kind of informed by topics they wanted to do, and then sort of the rest of it was kind of us in the Museum of London. So a kind of even co-produced split, I think. In terms of the methodology, I'll go over some of the numbers about the sample size that you'll be looking at. We had 3,038 young people from across London. The average age of participants was 18.7. I mean, it was 16 to 25, so it was slightly on the younger age. We had more young women than young men, so 70% young women. I mean, it was like 85% in the first kind of month, and we actually had to do a lot of targeted work just to kind of bring it down a little bit more equal. I think the turnaround for this project was only about 2.5 months. So I think if we had a bit longer, we probably would have continued to kind of balance that out a little bit. 1 in 10 young people have considered themselves to have a disability, and as you can see on the right is the breakdown in terms of young people's ethnicity. I mean, it isn't a perfect categorization. We got a lot of complaints and pushback from it, especially from young people, but we use the one that kind of government figures try to use as well, to kind of be able to create a comparison. In terms of borough distribution as well, we got a fairly good representation from most boroughs, overrepresentation from certain boroughs like Camden and Hackney. We know they've got big youth services, Southwark, Merton, where we have some sort of links. I think the boroughs that are least represented tend to be more the outer London boroughs. Havering was one of the least, and Newham we got sort of, less than 0.5%. So it was kind of averagely even throughout all of them. I mean, the range was average about 2% to 4%. Outside of that was a bit more of an outlier, but a good representation from all of them. And because we're dealing with a sample of sort of 3,000, you could say that we got at least 100 in each borough as a minimum, which was important to us. In terms of how we actually did the survey and incentivization, we had a main prize of £350 on ASOS and Amazon vouchers, followed by a 1-year subscription to Netflix, Apple, Spotify, then 10 £50 vouchers. This was informed by the young people that we spoke to. They wanted more prizes rather than a small amount that were large. And then we tried to sort of ground the prizes. So instead of just an arbitrary number, we gave them the option just to have cash as well. But, saying Netflix, vouchers, ASOS, it was things that young people maybe more likely to be interested in on first glance. We advertised it out through our networks, but also some social media. And I think key was some paid advertising through social media, kind of getting that audience of people we wouldn't normally reach. I mean, I think out of the sample that we had, it's impossible to say, but I think a large proportion of them were young people who weren't known to us or our networks in the youth sector. Because it was a far more diverse sample in terms of geography and ethnicity than I think we'd ever got for any of our research. So I think social media advertising was key in this. And as I said, there were numerous attempts to balance both through social media advertising and contacting certain organisations that worked with specific demographics. So in terms of data analysis, Excel sheet, which we, because we did it on Typeform, which instead of SurveyMonkey, we use Typeform because it's kind of more youth engaging, but its tools in the back room aren't quite as good. But we downloaded the Excel, cleaned it and prepared it for SPSS. We did a couple of things with the data. The first thing in terms of ethnicity data, we recoded it to 2 additional levels of detail, or simplification. We simplified it to ethnicity simplified. So instead of having 30 categories, we kind of have 6. And then looking at BAME, so how much is the BAME representation within each question? The second one was postcode data, and this was a bit of a nightmare because we let them type in whatever postcode they want. So there was a big clear up process because some people put the first line, some people put the second line, some people got their postcodes wrong. So we did some work and then basically recoded it as borough. So what part of the borough, what borough are they residing in? And from the borough data, we also found what part of London they are, very simply north, south, east, west. And from those boroughs, you know, we broke the boroughs down into poverty quartiles, top 25%, bottom 25%, and in between. And then lastly, inner London boroughs, outer London boroughs, to see the difference between that. In terms of the relationships, all the relationships found in the report, everything that we state was run through statistical analysis, and basically all the findings reported we found to be statistically significant where the p-values were less than 0.05. So we made sure that there was some sort of statistical correlation in there, you know, which was a shame because there was lots of data that was like, that's really interesting, but then it just didn't have any statistical analysis significance, so we couldn't include it. In terms of the key findings, I'm going to go through very quickly what the key findings of the report are and just some graphs that illustrate it. In part 1, issues for young Londoners, kind of broadly, you know, education, employment, mental health comes up as the top things. And then we'll dig down into how it changed across different groups, which was kind of the more interesting finding, I think. The second one is just generally about optimism. So young people we know that in the UK, teenagers are the least optimistic in Europe. And I think that finding kind of leads through to the London stuff. They're less optimistic about their problems being solved and less optimistic about those being in power. Those in power know how to solve their issues. In terms of identity and space, this is about their identity rather than how they use space. Overwhelmingly identified as Londoners, and so obviously, so the identity of Londoners was far greater than regional identity or their national identity. And one second. And they also feel a sense of ownership over their area, but that changed depending on the group. Right, part 3. So cultural spaces, we looked at how they actually visited spaces. So because there's a Museum of London report, they were mostly interested in art spaces and cultural spaces. But we went through a range of spaces, which I'll show you in a second. So parks and green spaces were most likely to use, youth clubs are the least likely. And again, the difference between groups, again, the graphs illustrate it better. And in terms of changing London, we asked them about gentrification and having a sense of ownership over their local area. And that differs between inner and outer. Right, so in terms of, you know, the broad issues of them, that's kind of the graph looking at it. So we're looking at average, and we broke it down by ethnicity and gender and everything that was statistically significant. I think the most interesting one for us was around BAME young people. So for BAME young people, education was the highest, and they were more likely to say that safety in the police and having their voices heard was more important to them. But as you can see from white British young people, education drops down to like the second lowest. And for them, employment, housing, and air pollution and the environment was more important. And you kind of see a difference between inner London, outer London as well, and gender. So that's kind of the point about this entire report through every single bit of it, that kind of the broad findings, the headline data is stuff that we already kind of know. We already kind of know what the priorities are, you know, that gentrification is a bad thing, and they feel like Londoners. But it's when you kind of dig down into the detail between different groups, especially ethnicity being one of the biggest predictors of difference in his opinions and perceptions, where I think the value of this report was. So this is inner and outer London. So outer London, Inner London, quite predictably, the only things that they say are more important than outer London was housing and air pollution in the environment. Everything else, outer London was more likely to say it was important. And that kind of just chimes with, we know what we know about inner London housing and air pollution. So it kind of makes sense. In terms of using London spaces, this is just kind of an average across all of them. This is the proportion of young people who said that they use it sometimes, often, or very often. And kind of worrying statistics around the youth clubs, because what we know about youth club cuts in the past 10 years, it's not that surprising, but 17% is still quite low. And cultural and art spaces were kind of depending on the young person, and sports venues, for example, young men were far more likely than young women to. I mean, the only thing anyone could agree on was parks and green spaces. As you can see from this one, this is just art spaces, looking at young men and young women and different ethnicities, and young men in South Asian and Black groups, communities are least likely across all of them to use art spaces. We also touched on COVID, but we'll be doing more about that, just about how COVID has changed their view on the local area. I mean, this was run over summer, so I think the first lockdown was just ending, and this was more about qualitative data, which isn't included in the data sheet, but we collected, we collected a lot of qualitative data just to do some word clouds and got some peer researchers to do some qualitative analysis about what it said. And as you can see, the sort of majority of mixed and Black and South Asian young people said that COVID didn't really change their view on their local area. Only white young people actually thought that COVID-19, the experience of lockdown, had changed how they felt about their community, neighbours or local area. So lastly, going into changing London, just a very basic one. Do you want to live in London in the future, and the differences between that? With South Asian white young people being the most likely to want to, with Black young people, less than a majority wanted to live in London in the future or didn't know. But then when you ask them if they could live in London in the future, it kind of reverses. South Asian young people were the most likely to want to and were the most optimistic that they would be able to, while Black young people were the second most likely to, the least likely to say they wanted to, but the second most likely to think that they could. It's about optimism in the housing market. In terms of gentrification, we look at whether gentrification is a good thing or a bad thing. Unsurprisingly, it's quite a loaded term. A majority across all groups thought that gentrification was a bad thing. But we kind of tried to delve a bit more in terms of ownership and whether developments bring opportunities into different groups. I think the most striking one for me was we asked how pushed out of the areas they grew up in young people felt, and Black young people were most likely to feel pushed out of the areas they grew up in, and that was across every single area of London except West London, and I think that's literally just a sampling error because there were just less numbers in West London. So that's all kind of data. I mean, the report is there's quite a lot in there, not all of it's represented in graph. I think in terms of what's next, very, very quickly, we are going to build on this. I think the Museum of London is using it for curating London and their work going forward with that whenever it opens again. For us, we're looking to do a survey of young Londoners, which will be a survey of 4,000 to 5,000 young people. We want to build on the Museum of London stuff, except we're looking far more about in detail on each of those issues. So not what is the most important issue for you, is it housing or employment, but looking down about what issues, what policies, what perceptions do you have about housing that matter to you. And the kind of idea of that is the GLA did a study in 2009, which was of young Londoners, a kind of state of young Londoners, and they did it again in 2005, did it before in 2005. And we kind of want to kind of replicate that. So at the start of this new decade, where are young Londoners across a range of issues? And hopefully that will provide a really big data set that loads of organisations can use to do some cross-sector manifesto for young Londoners campaigning ahead of the election. And we're going to support it with some smaller peer research projects in local settings. So if you want to know about that or any of the research before, there's my email. Happy to talk about it, or if there's any questions.